Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 83 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Curt and Jerry today. We are going to continue our series on trauma-informed workplaces. This week, we're going to talk about shared leadership and its role in trauma-informed organizations and workplaces. So a topic I've thought a lot about, read a lot about, so I'm excited to see what Curt and Jerry think about it as well. So as always, we start out with bright, shiny objects of the week, and I feel like I have like 6 of them since we took last week off because everybody was traveling everywhere. So want to say hi to some new friends I know we have listed from my trip to San Jose. And I'll start out, and I've listened to a couple books, so I'm going to spread them out. But there was one, and this is a little depressing as a bright, shiny object, but it really hit me in a powerful way when we think about trauma. And it was a book on, if you're an Audible member, you can download free Audible productions, and they're actually really good, and they're free, which I like. And one of them was called The Beautiful Game, and it looks at CTE and concussions over in English soccer. And it's really a well done. They do a lot of interviews, so it's more of like a long form produced podcast than necessarily an audiobook. And one of the things that just struck me is kind of one of those things in hindsight is, of course I should have thought about this. But a lot of the studies on CTEs and concussions and traumatic brain injuries have been done around athletes. And there was a point of this book where they were talking about soccer, and they were talking to, I know him as Bennett, it's his first name, but it's what I can remember, the physician, that really started the movement with the National Football League. And one time she's like, well, what about females? What about a female brain? What goes on with those? And it's not been studied nearly as much, but they're starting to look at CTEs, traumatic brain injuries, as far as intimate partner violence. And one of the things that one of the neurobiologists said that just it hit me in the gut, and it makes a lot of sense, I think, to put it on all of our radars is important, is that she says a lot of times when an athlete experiences a severe concussion, they're brought out of the game. They immediately get world-class health care. They get support. They're not allowed to get back on the practice field until they pass protocol. So a lot of times these folks are living at least stable lives. An injury happens, they get support, their life remains stable for the most part until they get sort of back to normal functioning. And she brought up, again, intimate partner violence, but I also think about a lot of the folks, the 3 of us have worked with who've experienced child abuse as well. And that there is now a well-documented high rate of the CTs and concussions for folks who've experienced that. And there's some indication, because it's a traumatic event, there's also the physiological and neurobiological response to the psychological trauma. And they're starting to get data to show that makes recovery from the traumatic brain injury more difficult biologically. And so that mixture between traumatic brain injuries and the recovery from those on top of the psychological trauma of abuse, it's like, wow, I hadn't thought about that. And then I said, why hadn't I thought about this? It makes so much sense. But I just like to put that on people's radar. A lot of times I think when we get abuse, we might focus on one or the other depending on our expertise. But just really showing where the research is going on this. So it's not kind of bright and shiny as far as fun, but boy, it put something on my radar that I'm glad it did. So hopefully other people's are just a little bit more happy than mine. So I started out with my depressing one. Jerry, what are you thinking about this week?
You know, I was in New York and I got to walk on the High Line, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's a walkway in Manhattan that goes from downtown up to 34th Street that basically they do the landscaping with trees and nice shrubs. So you're in the city, but you kind of have an opportunity to kind of be closer to nature in the city. And so one is just the awareness of that need for reconnecting with nature, even in this cement jungle. I thought was a kind of neat kinds of, and there's looking at that. But I also, while I was in the city, you know, recognizing, you know, I was hanging out in Washington Square, and how many of the street people come out with music, and how important that is just to the kind of ambiance and sense of what's happening. And so, you know, really want to, in some ways, we kind of talk about homelessness as this kind of negative thing. But I was really touched by what a contribution they make to the community in this kind of ambiance. So I think as we kind of think about these individuals as kind of outside the parameters of our, of our kind of economic framework, not really missing the way they can contribute to us in the community. And there was some really neat, people playing guitars, people playing drums. There was another one with kind of a puppet that they were doing some things, kind of making some money, you know, in the park. But I really sat back and watched as people walked by. The rhythms of their steps changed, you know, as they came through. So as we kind of get in touch with these kind of rhythms in the city, I was just really touched by the contribution they made to the well-being of everybody in that park. So hats off to them.
Very cool. Curt, what about you?
Better than CT concussions.
Yes,
huh?
yes, much better than mine. Yes.
Way to brighten it up, Jerry. I was thinking, Matt, when you said, what about the female brain, about we need to get your wife on and let her be a guest while we ask her about your understanding of the female brain.
No, not going to happen. Here it is, Curt. Here it is.
See how that goes.
It's superior in every way.
There you go. There you go.
Brain.
And that is absolutely true.
Statistically proven. Statistically superior.
You've learned well, young grasshopper.
Yes, I try.
I have one, and I actually brought it with me. It's a workbook called Attachment by Christina Reese. Cool. I've been using it recently to help people in a variety of settings, both kids in residential treatment, kids in foster care, and adults in adult residential services, community-based residential services, to have some direct care staff have some guidance around how to actually navigate relationships with their own attachment in mind and with the attachment of their clients in mind. And what kind of questions do you ask, and what kind of activities do you do? Just a real nice little resource. So I thought that would be a great little, it's been useful to me. So I thought I'd throw it in.
Awesome. Give us the title and author one more time.
It's called Attachment, and the author is Christina Reese.
Awesome. Very cool. Good resource to throw out there. So let's dive in the topic. Curt got us another good article, which I'll post on traumainformedlens.org. And while this is a topic I've thought a lot about, since I've been my study about what would a trauma-informed organizational workplace look like, I'd love to get, Curt, kind of your thinking, since you gave us this article, kind of maybe run down some of the high points that stick out to you, and let's get this ball rolling.
Yep. There are really two, this is a short article, and it's really an intro to a bigger special issue, but I thought it was a nice quick synopsis of some thoughts about shared leadership versus some more traditional views about leadership. And I think that I'll reference a specific point in the article that I really liked a lot. It's in the first paragraph, and it talks about shared leadership and what it is, a kind of a definition of it. I thought one of the key phrases was that it is a social process. And I read that and I was kind of like, there's an hour's worth of discussion right there. Like, how is leadership a social process? So that'll be kind of like, that was the question that just popped into my head. And how do we think about leadership in terms of social interactional processes, rather than leadership in terms of getting people to do things? And I thought that was a really great question that this article kind of pulled out. And the second point is related in the difference between shared leadership and the decades-old paradigm of leadership is a person or a role. That leadership is more, shared leadership is more of influence in a 360-degree environment more than just a unidirectional environment. So those are kind of two key points that come out of this article. And again, it's a short one, not a whole lot of technical detail in this one, but it does give some references to other places to look for some of this stuff. And I thought those two kind of questions would be things that could really organize our discussion and thoughts today. So thinking about social processes, I certainly have learned a lot from both of you in our discussions of how we think about leadership and influence. I think that's a better word of thinking about that as influence rather than leadership. Might be an interesting way to kind of think about it as well. Going back to Jerry, I'll kind of toss it to you first, going back to, I think you have a really unique perspective I've always really appreciated, is a perspective coming from your experiences as a CEO of an organization, and then also in your experiences with helping other organizations with CEOs to think. That's a different kind of role that you've played in a couple of very important environments in which services are provided. Some perspectives that you might be able to share about those two things and how you've experienced those two things differently across those two roles.
You know, I always want to try to kind of tie it back to trauma, right? Because that's kind of what this is, a trauma-informed lens, right? So one of the issues with trauma is this issue of abuse of power, right? That's a really important component of it. And the other one is from the victim's perspective is a sense of helplessness and powerlessness. So when we kind of think about those dynamics and how they might get played out in an organization, shared leadership becomes an important antidote to some of those dynamics that get played out, right? And so trying to think about the role of a leader, right, a CEO, is that in shared leadership, it isn't the abdicating of your responsibility as a leader. That's a really important piece of it, is that you maintain your perspective as a leader in establishing some and enforcing some the mission in terms of kind of maintaining that vision, to kind of look at that, but really empowering the people who are participating in your group and in your organization to engage in deep conversations to discover innovative solutions to things, right? Is that the problems that we're facing are way more complex than any one individual can solve themselves. And the group as a whole, significantly better than any individual in the group. So this shared leadership model allows for solutions to emerge from the process that in some ways. And it also allows periodically, there's people in your group that have expertise that can take a leadership role at different times in the process. So, I as a leader, I have some responsibility to integrate these experiences and pull these people together and to create a safe place along with the team to have this. But different people have way more expertise on my team than I do in certain areas. So having this model allows us to maximize the talent we bring together. I think going along with that. And it also is going to help us combat this issue of helplessness or misuse of power. When we come together, is that, in the sanctuary model, they talk about democracy is the antidote to misuse of power if people actually use the process. As we see in our country right now, it's checks and balances aren't working so well. But to kind of look at that, but I think that's the point of is that, for me as a leader, I didn't gain my worth by, in some ways, having power over people. Mm-hmm. I gained my value as a leader by creating a space where we created innovative solutions to problems.
It reminds me of a quick experience that I had in a job interview a while ago. Matt, I'd love to get your perspective on this story because it comes from a quality improvement, quality assurance kind of perspective. So the job was to be a vice president of like quality assurance and clinical operations, right? And so a lot of the questions that people were asking me and determining whether or not I was qualified and could do this job was basically, what's the information that you have, or what's the knowledge base that you have that you could then disseminate to the rest of our organization so that they will do what we want them to do. And I reframed that a little bit and I said, I think I have plenty of that knowledge, but I think that the real issue is how are you going to gather information from your people so that you know what's going on and can create solutions that are actually meaningful for them. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that they didn't like that answer, basically. But I thought it was an interesting kind of example of how some of these older paradigms are really still alive and well in how we think about leadership and how we think about things as ubiquitous as quality assurance and quality improvement. And I know that was some of the work that you've done for a while. So I wondered what your kind of reaction was to that in the context of the shared leadership idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, I'll try to be a little succinct with this because I have so many thoughts on this topic. But, one of the things I think we get stuck in, especially in a field where sometimes we're just working so hard to keep the doors open. And I think when we get under stress, we get much more rigid. And when we get rigid, we will use our system power in ways that may not work for the greater good, so to speak. So, when I think about shared leadership, I use this analogy because I use an analogy for everything. Of let's look at the person that does have power over the system. And I like to, and it's a Friday afternoon, we're recording this. So for once, this almost seems appropriate to use this analogy. But it's, to me, leadership, one of the leadership approaches that's critical to any great leader is humility. And to me, humility is like a fine glass of whiskey. Now that I make a little bit more than minimum wage, I can look up when I go to a bar and not down in the well, right? You'll see some weird whiskey down there. Once you know about whiskey, you like weird names like Southwest Missouri whiskey, like weird stuff. Nothing wrong with Southwest Missouri whiskey if there is such a thing, but so a good whiskey, what I learned about it when I was learning about whiskey is you want to put a little water in your whiskey. You don't want to put ice because that changes the molecular structure of the oil. Never put ice in a good whiskey. Though if you do a Manhattan and you get one of those big ice cubes, that's acceptable. But with a good whiskey, you want to put a little water because they bottle it too strong. And when you put a little water in your whiskey, it opens up the flavor profile. And for me, one of the big, things that sets up shared leadership is that the person with the systematic power realizes that I don't have all the answers. That actually, and I think this is like in your interview question, you were speaking to this is, the people doing the work. And I think in the helping professions, this is even more so because, a lot of times I've supervised psychiatrists, psychologists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, music therapists, teachers, all these expertise that I don't have. And so when I, my humility allowed me to say, okay, how do I bring the best out of all of these folks to the surface so we can work on that? So part of the question that you said is like, we've got the answers. We just need these yahoos to follow us. And that's sort of a type of theory of organizational leadership called Taylorism after Frederick Taylor, who basically took Skinner and the behavioralist movement and in ways I don't think you would agree with necessarily, Curt, took this into the organization. And that's where we kind of get that employees are interchangeable parts of machines. And we want to make those parts operate as quickly and efficiently as possible. And if they don't, we replace that part. If you think of leadership from that perspective, yeah, we just need the machine to do what we're going to do. So I just want to throw out that the foundation of all this for me is realizing, hey, I don't have all the answers. And to me, if we talk about democracy, collaborative decision-making, if we bring humility to our work and our processes, Jerry really speaks well to talking about the organization as not a machine, but a living organic organism in some ways. And I think that really helps me see, okay, this isn't interchangeable parts. These are relationships we're talking about, not cogs in a machine. So that's just some of my initial things to throw out there is when we say, hey, we need people to do what we tell them to do, there's a reality. If you need to get reports in on time to get your grant funding, you've got to get stuff done. But at the same time, when we're talking about larger initiatives, going after a vision, fulfilling our mission, it's a lot more complex with that. And without that honesty, I see so many organizations get locked down in the rigidity of their leaders.
So when you think then, go back to the idea that the article brought up about that leadership is a social process, and you're balancing these two, those are often can be competing demands. It creates a dilemma. How do we get stuff done, essentially? How do we get our tasks done and have direction and have goals and all of that? And then also, how do we listen to one another and how do we interact with one another and create connection with one another and relationship with one another? I'll toss this to both of you. How do you personally balance some of those dilemmas when you're leading teams or coaching people to lead teams? What kind of advice do you give? And what are your own personal strategies? Maybe touch on a couple of those.
Go for it, Jerry.
First of all, I don't think I have a good answer for that, right? Because it's usually I've spent either too much time in the task or I spend too much time in kind of figuring. So I don't have a formula to give to this. What I could say is that in the formation of your team, for whatever is, what's the purpose of that team coming together, right? What is our job here? And then how are we going to establish for lack of better words, rules or norms about how we're going to interact, right? How are we going to do that? And then we engage in the task. And as long as we're moving along in the task and the task is moving along, I have found it's not necessarily important to kind of go back and look at the process of the group, right? The process, if we're getting our work done, to do it. But then either when we're done with that task, I asked the group to stop back and say, what did we learn and how could we do it better? Are we satisfied with how we did it? Kind of look. or there's periods of time where we seem to be having a hard time making decisions, right? Or there's some stress in the group. And then I'll stop and get out of the task and say, can we talk a little bit about how we're doing together? So I think my job in kind of facilitating this is that the best energy for a group is success in the task that they have, right? But if there's something that's getting in the way, it's my job to stop and say, let's get out and kind of look what's going on. And balancing those perspectives is that art of this. It's not, I don't know it's a science, it's an art of how to kind of balance these kind of dilemmas. But I do think there is a science to creating, and Matt could talk about this, is as you create that team, there's some things you need to take care of as you're creating it, and kind of looking at it. And then once it's created, when do you stop and go back and examine your norms? Do you empower anybody to stop the team to say, let's kind of looking at some of those things?
Yeah.
So, Matt, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that part of the process.
Yeah, and I would continue to use the word shared. We're talking about shared leadership here, but I want to bring in 3 other shares that I think are critical. One is shared expectations. When you talk about getting something done, Curt, me telling you to do something without you knowing why it's important to get done is a pretty crappy way to motivate somebody. It doesn't, you may get somebody to, there's a great thing, I forget the author, but the difference between motivation and movement. If I yell at you, you might move to get something done, but you'll stop after you complete the task. Whereas if we create a shared expectation, we understand what we expect from each other. And yeah, reports are done at the end and that's we've taken the time to do. Just a little fun piece of research here. Research shows that when they surveyed supervisors and their employees and said to the employees, what are your expectations do you think your supervisor has of you? And then ask the supervisor what expectations you actually have of your employees, those don't match up. So we have to make sure when I say shared expectations, we actually have a conversation is, okay, what do you expect from me in my job? Because your job description, I've tested this out all across the country, as long as our job descriptions have that last bullet point, all other duties as assigned, your brain skips everything else on that list. So it's okay to have a job description, but as long as we keep putting that bullet point, you could wash my car, do my grocery shopping, all those things. So shared expectations is key. Shared values is another one. How do we go about making decisions? This is where Jerry's talking about. This can also be for norms as well. Values tell us how do we act and interact with each other. And really spending some time, Jim Collins, and you can go to, I believe it's just jimcollins.com, and his Built to Last page on that site has great shared value creation exercises that are really good. That's probably a whole nother podcast in and of itself. And then a shared vision of what we're all working towards and why this is important. So to me, shared leadership is built on the foundation of a lot. And maybe, Jerry, this is a little bit of maybe it's not necessarily a science because there's a lot of art to each of these, but more of a checklist if you can think about, okay, do we have shared expectations around this? Do we have shared values or norms of how we act when we are working as a team or interacting with clients? And sort of what are we all working towards? And then the shared leadership process is like democracy, collaborative decision-making, kind of give us a structure of how we implement all of this around major decisions.
So Matt and Curt, whatever, how do you think trauma these are basically business models, right? That you're reading, Built to Last, they're business models. How does trauma, why would these things be even more important in a trauma organized system or a trauma informed system?
Mm-hmm.
Curt, you want to take?
I have a couple of thoughts about that, and going back to something, Jerry, you were saying, it reminded me, is when you said, I don't really have a process for this. And I think watching you, and over the years that I got that opportunity, I kind of learned a process by watching you, which is so interesting.
Operationalize everything.
That's what my brain works, right? And I think it's an important one. Maybe it's worth saying, because maybe there are other people out there who are like me that could figure out a process from that or need something, right? So I watched you, and when you say, I either spent too much time on the task or too much time on connecting, or something other than task related, right? Maybe it wasn't connecting. I don't know. Maybe it was having fun at a bar. I don't know. Anyway, so the thing that I learned from you was to be open to recognizing when you spent too much time on either one, and then getting feedback from the group and adjusting. And rather than thinking of, oh, I spent too much time doing task oriented, or I failed because I spent too much time not on task-oriented activities, you didn't view it as a failure. You viewed it as feedback and an opportunity. And now I know how to shift. Now I know what this group needs. And so for me, I could take a process from that, because I came into it with these old existing paradigms of leadership, which was you get to be a leader because you have knowledge or information or ability that the rest of the group doesn't have. And that may be true, but it also, there are lots that you don't have, that, you're not suddenly bestowed all these other things that you have different than the group, and you need the group to help you. And so for me, that was an important process to watch and learn from, and that I no longer had to feel like I wasn't doing my job as a leader if I spent too much time or not enough time on the task. It helped me to have that kind of a model. And so that was an important one. And I think learning that in an environment where there was so much trauma, nobody came through our doors without it. And that created so much affect within our organization. And it amplified these power differentials, even if they weren't as big as they seemed. The impact of having the emotional labor piece of what we did, when you're like, nobody was coming to us for services, or our business was not in existence because people said, oh, I have some discretionary income, let me go get some treatment for the trauma that I went through. Like, that's not how that went. It was like, there was a different level of activation and a different level of emotional reactivity that got people through our doors. And so that meant that that's what our staff had to deal with day after day after day after day. And it created bigger perceptions of power differentials. And so from a leadership perspective, sharing leadership and minimizing the perception of power differentials and increasing people's input into decision-making really helped to combat that part of our business. So that's my kind of answer to your question of how trauma impacts this and makes it more important that we do it.
Yeah. And I would just, my understanding of that one is, I think we would all agree with this, and this is part of my leadership trainings, if trust and safety don't, psychological, physical, moral safety does not exist, shared leadership's not going to work. So part of this is going back to that really foundational piece of making sure that we've established organizations that have high levels of trust and safety between employees. So part of this is all built on that foundation. Now the other answer to that question, Jerry, which I think is a great one, is that a lot of times, even though there are differences, there are clear differences between the teacher and the student, or the therapist and the client, or the physician and the patient, I really saw the model of relationships that I had with my staff as at least in the energy that I wanted to establish with my staff, I wanted that to be a model for their relationships with the clients. So in some ways, shared expectations and shared values were the boundaries, right? Here are the perimeters of our relationships. Here's how we keep our relationships healthy. Shared vision is, what are we working towards? What are your goals for care or treatment moving forward? So, and obviously there's more than that per se, but it's really with shared leadership. I want to be, and I like the concept because it puts me in the right mental mode of servant leadership, is I'm here to help you be successful versus I'm here to tell you what to do. And I really think that, there's a lot more to servant leadership that we don't have, again, all these can go off on their own 2-hour conversations, but really trying to structure what creates a healthy staff to staff relationship or supervisor to staff relationship, because that energy is what I want my staff to take into their client, patient, student. So seeing that as the model, really for a lot of that. And again, there's so many things about the trauma-informed relationship, helping relationship, that I want my people to feel empowered. I want them, I did have power. I did your employee evaluations, but I wanted to make sure I was aware of that and treated that with a lot of respect and caution and treated you with as much dignity as I could through that process. So I see there's a lot of parallels, and the healthier my relationships were with staff, the better outcomes we got in our program. And that's not an easy thing to do and maintain with all the stress and rigidity that can be in our systems at times.
What would you add to that, Jerry? How does trauma make it more important to share leadership?
Well, I guess the thought for me is that understanding how stress impacts the individual and how stress impacts the group. And when I say group, it could be a team, it could be a program, it could be your whole organization, it could be all the people who are interacting with the program. But understanding that stress creates that, some of these intentional structures, making sure you're aligned in values, making sure you have a purpose, making sure you have some norms, allows us in some ways to not be organized by the stress, but organized by our vision and our purpose, and a kind of looking at that, right? So I think that you're constantly, so things like, we know when you're stressed, your ability to process verbal information goes down, right? So creating a place where there's a way to kind of take votes where everybody has input, whether it's verbal and not verbal, to kind of making sure people have some sense of power and control in the group kind of process. We know that in some ways it's going to be really hard for us to sit back and pause and reflect, as opposed to feeling like there's a need to, in some ways, act with emergency. So creating a way for us not to quickly move to solution, but really get a variety of ideas out and then kind of explore those ideas, right? So we have a process in which we make decisions to kind of, so setting those things up, I think, in some ways protect us from, in some ways, becoming polarized, having really very concrete right and wrong kinds of, or your way or my way kinds of ways of solving problems, and really engaging in deep conversation to kind of be able to do it. So I think that the shared leadership is a component of setting those things up, right? Because when we set up this sense of shared leadership, there's an underlying message that each of you have a responsibility when you come to this team, right? As opposed to, I'm going to give you information, you're going to listen to it, write it down, and then go carry it out, and then my job is to monitor you to make sure it happens. It's like, we're going to collectively create something, and then we're going to collectively figure out the best way to implement it, and then collectively talk about how should we know when we're successful and when not successful. So it changes the dynamics that I think Matt would say is that should also theoretically change the dynamics between our employees and the people they're serving.
Parallel processes, baby.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Curt, let me ask you a question. And I'm going to just stereotype you like I always stereotype because you know I love you. So,
You're like, let me ask you what a behavior is.
Before you do that, Matt, remember that he started out with a book on attachment.
I know.
Thank you, Gary. Finally, Gary.
I feel like you know I love you, so I could just ask a question without.
What are we, like 83 episodes? 83?
I know, but I gotta ask because the Taylorism approach is still prevalent, and it's based on Skinner, and I think as we've talked about when we did pop behavioralism. Untrained behavioralists can do crazy things and sometimes harmful things with behavioral science. But so all that, and I love you. So all this questions asked and just wanted to learn from you. So knowing that, again, Frederick Taylor's the first chapter of any organizational business book. It's he is the B.F. Skinner of the business world. Behavioralism and what we're based on. So I'd love to get your opinion as a behavioralist. Is and I'm trying to think about other examples, but the approach to studying behavior has a lot of times been an expert putting in place rewards and consequences to promote or distinguish certain behaviors without sort of a lot of input from those whose behaviors are going to change, or Pavlov's dog, or the mice, right? The mice are having a focus group on, where they want the cheese, right? And so I see this because I see so many people stuck in this model of leadership still. Because again, if I've got power and I've got anxiety, I'm going to use my power to try to get people to move. And I kind of wonder, when you think about shared leadership, this seems to go against some of my understanding of behavioralists, if I'm going to be nice, but my experience, I think overall is, hey, let's get the adults in the room together and talk about how to change this kid's behavior, right? And so I kind of wonder, from your perspective of using shared leadership to get change behaviors to improve outcomes, how does this integrate into your thinking and philosophy?
What were you going to say, Jerry?
I put a lid on what I was going to say.
I thought I was pretty regulated there.
I screamed
it. Important. Okay, that was a long question, Matt.
Yes.
Let me go back. Okay, I'm going to go back to your first premise that it's behaviorism that says we should use rewards to change behavior. It is not. That's people.
Okay.
That's just people do that, right? We all do it. We all get it. It's a part of who we are as a species. We all understand that. That's people. Behaviorism is the study of how environmental influences impact behavior. That's a different question.
Okay.
Right? So it's not about rewards and punishments. That's not behaviorism. Right? That's people. We all get that. Okay. So when you think about now that you have, if we're curious about what influences behavior, how I think about that is that we started out, and we've kind of talked about a lot of this before, we started out with introspection as how we were studying what impacts behavior. It was a poor methodology for science. So we had to have a movement against that, and that's where John B. Watson came along, basically, and said we should just study behavior. Right? And he was really arguing against introspection as a scientific methodology. And so then it went historically from there, right? And Skinner basically used Darwin's basic metaphor of selection by consequences, or natural selection, and he used it as selection by consequences. That's the metaphor. So when you look at Taylor, right? That's one of many metaphors for understanding organizations. One of which is the closed system machine metaphor. Another one is the open system living organism metaphor. There's also a cultural metaphor. We look at all of Morgan's 8 metaphors, and now we've got enough metaphors that people are arguing for meta metaphors. We need a metaphor to understand all the metaphors. And I think that's a great point, that we use metaphors to understand phenomena. And some of them are really useful, and some of them outlive their utility. And I think that at one point in time, as people thought a lot about organizations as closed systems, the component analysis of the machine metaphor, which, I mean, you can say it came from Skinner. I don't know. I've never heard that until now, but I can see that because you're studying component parts, right? And any one of them, you can change it out, right? That's a machine metaphor. It's useful in some ways. In an environment where we're dealing with so much emotional labor now, any job that we have now that's not replaced by a machine or a computer requires social intelligence and emotional intelligence. That's why we have people doing those jobs. Mm-hmm. And so where you need a different metaphor to understand the complexity of an organization, where you have people who are engaged in tasks that require social and emotional intelligence. Just interchanging like component parts doesn't work anymore. It's not a metaphor that's useful for that type of an organization. So that's where I kind of think that goes. When you think then about things that influence behavior, how we think and the affect that we feel and the sensations that our body has all impact behavior. There's no question about that. We now have the technology to study that, and it clearly has a big impact on it. It doesn't mean that things that happen outside of our skin, like rewards and punishments, don't have an impact. They have a very large impact. So incorporating both of those is really important. And I think that's one of the things that really drives me and kind of gives me a lot of energy around these kinds of conversations, is to get people who are trained like I was to think in slightly different ways, and not really to replace what they already learned, but to add something to it. And I think that's, I get real jazzed by that.
How do you see shared power? And in your way you look at things and human behavior, because we want staff performing, whether you come from my mindset, your mindset, whatever, we want staff performing at their best every minute they're at work, that sort of thing. So how do you look at this in the context of kind of how you look at system performance and human behavior?
That's a real complex question.
But it was short. You complained the other one was too long.
So it goes with the shortness of the question, the complexity goes up. So we've talked about the difference between contingency-shaped behavior and rule-governed behavior before. Let's review that. This is the basics of how I think about this. So you can have contingency-shaped behavior. I can stick my finger in a light socket and find out that it hurts, and I don't ever do that again. And I can have behavior that is, I go to buy a lottery ticket and I win the lottery the next day. I love buying lottery tickets. I learned that was a good thing, right? We can have actual contingency-shaped behavior. We can also have rule-governed behavior. And some people argue this is uniquely human, and now we're finding out that it probably isn't uniquely human. Other animals probably do this too. But Matt, you can tell me, hey, if you go buy a lottery ticket, you'll win the next day. Mm-hmm. And I can go do that and never experiencing, and I'll keep doing it for a long time. Or you can tell me it's not a good idea to stick your finger in a light socket. Don't do it, because I did it and it hurt. And I don't do that. Yeah. And my behavior is influenced by that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes really strongly, and sometimes in direct competition with contingency-shaped behavior. Mm-hmm. You can tell me something's a good idea, and I still don't do it. My doctors will say this all the time, right? I asked a doctor friend of mine, like, how do you like your job? And he's like, it's really interesting. I spend most of my time trying to keep people from killing themselves and fighting them every step of the way. Mm-hmm. Because I got to tell them to do things that they don't want to do. And it seems kind of nonsensical. But we have this concept of rule-governed behavior, which is a lot of our cultural kind of metaphors. And so having rules around who has power and how do I make that person happy? How do I please that person and avoid displeasing that person? We develop all kinds of rules about that. Mm-hmm. Some of them are explicitly stated, some of them are not. And so that governs a lot of our behavior. And I would argue much more of our behavior than does contingencies. Mm-hmm. We actually have a lot of rule-governed behavior. Yeah. Some of it generated based on what we have experienced, some of it based on what we've watched other people experience, and some of it from what we have heard other people have experienced. Like, so you have story, and we have legends, and like all of those things that kind of help us to manage our culture. All of those things influence behavior. So all of that I find interesting. And even just thinking about contingency shape, that's a small thing. It's a small part of what influences our behavior. It's a very powerful one, but it's probably a smaller portion than rule-governed behavior and some cultural influences.
Fascinating.
That for a long answer to a short question.
Yeah. So I got one more I got to ask, because I know we're kind of running short on time. But there's a thing. There's always something I think about, because there's some research that's been done that says. I find it interesting that 25% of people would fire their boss if they could. And I wonder, this is a wonder, and if, if anybody has the courage out there to do it, I will give you free consulting services to help you set it up, as long as you promise not to sue me afterwards. But what if we, as a culture here in the United States and really Western society and liberal democracies, what if we could have votes of confidence on the leadership and organization? What if we could elect our own leaders in an organization? And why would we be so scared when we really talk about shared leadership and shared power? This is where I get people up against a wall, where it's a fun place, like I do to Curt, try to do it every week to him. But like, I believe my theory, because there's only a few examples of where this happens, very few in the business world or anywhere else, is that it would actually, if you structured it right, be a positive thing to have an election every couple years and have at least a vote of confidence. It'd be, and who do you want your leadership to be to represent you? And I don't know. I mean, like that, to me, that's radical democracy within an organizational context. But we seem that even though Ben Franklin might have said democracy is the least worst form of government we've ever found, but I would argue it probably makes more logical sense than how we structure our nonprofits with a board of directors, some of which are just on the board for networking, or they get us a great deal on a 16-passenger van. And then they oversee a dictator, basically, that as long as you keep the oligarchy happy, you've got pretty much absolute power. So as a counter to that, what would you think would happen if we, again, well thought out, well structured, but why don't we elect our leaders in organizations like we do in government? If we're really going to live democracy and shared leadership, put your job on the line.
That's a good question.
Well, I can answer that as a CEO.
Yeah.
Is nobody in my organization had the skill set that I had. Is that I was specifically hired in for a particular skill set. And that, therefore, I had to respect that other people in my organization had a skill set that I didn't have, right? So it isn't that anybody could step up and do my job and I couldn't step down and do anybody else's job, right? So I think that in a way, not everybody in the organization can go to the legislature and talk in the legislature. Not everybody can go in, right? There are requirements for a particular role and responsibilities, right?
So
the issue for you and to do it is, you're really saying, I would say is that, how could you reframe when you say is you have this dictator running this organization?
Mm-hmm. Structurally.
then in some ways, that's who the board wanted to run the organization.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me frame a question to you, Jerry, because I agree with what you're saying, but I would argue, and I don't have any evidence.
You always argue.
I know. Well,
that's why I liked you on my team.
Yes, exactly. but so I would argue that the people that interact with you every day as your staff have a better judgment of whether you do have the skills and whether you're successful in your work than those people on the board who don't see the impact or interact with you.
Yeah, and I would say that that's what they believe. But there's so much of my job that I did outside of them, so that they had a perspective that was very, very valuable and very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So really, in my getting my evaluation, the board should theoretically talk to the people that I'm interacting with. But there was also many parts of my job that had nothing to do directly with the people that were on my team. They were in the community. They were with fundraisers. They with collaborators outside to kind of do it. So that it's in a way that what you're really raising is why you have to have shared leadership. Is that I do things that nobody else does, and you do. How do we come together to maximize that? Right? I don't, in my job, I got paid differently. I got paid differently for it. One, because of my experience to kind of look at that, and also because of the fact that I was the only one that was contracted in the organization. Right? I worked for them. But at the same time you really don't, you're not, there's people on my board that have to evaluate my business sense. Mm-hmm. There's people on my board that I have lawyers on my board about my legal decisions to kind of looking at that. So it's a very complex process. But what you're asking for, which makes a whole lot of sense, is how do we have people have input into the evaluation of this person who's really overseeing this.
Yeah.
Right? What is the input that allows you to feel like you just not hearing that, somebody who never sees you work does an evaluation of you.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's a very fair, valid point.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's lots of things that I'm responsible for that nobody on this team sees me do.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. And I think a leader like you walks in with a presence that, having worked for you for a couple of years, I have no doubt whatsoever if we had a vote, you would have stayed king of the island, so to speak. I'd have no doubt about that.
But I could tell you there were things about finances that I was learning so my board was evaluating me on other things that you guys didn't necessarily see, right?
I agree. And yet I've seen the other side of the equation where I haven't worked for Jerry Yager, where I've worked for people who did a really good job of communicating one way to the board, because this is structurally kind of how it's designed, one way to the board, but treated staff in a whole different way. So I think ideally if this, and I don't like the structure of that. So that's a different conversation.
Matt, this goes back to why I was asking the question, what should it look like in a trauma-informed organization?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not you work for people and it probably wasn't very trauma-informed.
Yeah.
Right? So what does it look like in a trauma that people feel like they have a voice, they feel heard, they feel included, they feel valued, they feel supported, and
way to bring up issues.
And maybe part of that is how they get input into an evaluation process. Right? So I keep bringing it back to how do we have people feel not helpless and powerless? How do we not abuse power in a trauma-informed environment? How do we maximize our ability to hold really, in some ways, dialectical dilemmas and not get pushed into one side of them or the other. What is the processes we kind of create that allow us to do this? One of those is shared leadership.
Yeah.
Right? One of those is when we have people participate, that is an antidote to some of the kind of stressors that come with working with a traumatized population.
Yep. Curt, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the points have been made basically, right? That what you're proposing, it sounds like, is how do we have a check and a balance on power within organizations? And the ultimate check and balance is that if you abuse it, you lose it.
Yeah.
Which elections do that, right? That's our democracy, right? So to go to that far that would be really hard for any organization to do. Not that it's not a good idea, not that it's not an interesting kind of thought-provoking experiment. For those who are listening, I think, who want to go, how do I move my organization or my team to more trauma-informed? I think the takeaway from that conversation is, how do you maximize people's ability, and how do you have structures so that they can give input into the decisions that affect them? Like, in any incremental movements you can make towards that is a movement towards becoming more trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. And I think that's kind of the takeaway from the discussion. I don't think there are any further kind of points to add on there, other than to kind of summarize it that way. And if you want to move that direction, improve the people's ability to have a voice in decisions and have a voice in what happens, and for you to get feedback from the people that if you're in the role of a leader, then that's kind of a great way to move that direction.
Yeah. And I always, just a few technical things that I really like is, and a few research pieces. What we see a lot of great benefits on cross-functional teams. So getting people even within organizations out of silos, working together on problems is a great way, I think, to really live this. One of the things that I've really liked, that I put into structure in departments and other things I've ran, but I've seen a really successful organizational wide is, and I always like to have a brief paperwork process to get people to think through it a little bit, but having staff be able to bring larger issues and improvement ideas to the surface. I always like to have a one-page paper. I don't want to make too much paperwork, but I want people to think it out a little bit about really having them be able to identify problems and at least identify initial steps to solution those problems. But that, to me, as a leader, allowed me to, if I didn't identify something, it didn't mean it got on my radar that way as well. And again, that was a really good structure as well. There's a great book on this topic called The Future of Management by Gary Hamel, Hamel. He does look at a few organizations that are doing more democratic stuff. Gore-Tex is one of my favorites, who, because they work on project teams, they do elect leaders through votes of who to lead those teams. But project team-based engineering organization versus a non-profit helping organization are two very different things, where you need different expertise. But it is the one model I've seen out there that's actually doing a little bit of what I like to call radical democracy. So a really good book if you want to explore this topic further. So I think this obviously is an important thing and leads off to many directions. So we'll continue our discussion. I love this, guys. Thanks so much for another great discussion. We will put the article on our website at traumainformedlens.com. It's a quick read, but I think we'll give you some context for our discussion. And Curt, Jerry, as always, loved our conversation. And just remember the takeaway: don't put ice in your whiskey, put water in your whiskey. So that's the thing everybody remembers from my talk. So you guys have a great one, and we'll see everybody next week. Take care.